message of this neighborhood art in Washington, D.C. is that drugs lead to death. That fatal prediction was true for the vast majority of the 119 people murdered in Washington in the last 79 days.
Sit down and make sure the medicine works. Sit. Why you shoot up?
City officials say some 80% of the killings were related to drugs. The open and highly profitable trade in crack cocaine and the hallucinogen PCP spawned deadly disagreements in the city almost every night this year. Like other large cities, the drug culture had become a way of life for many Washington residents, and officials despaired about the pervasiveness of the problem. Most of the killings occurred in and around the dozens of drug markets in Washington's poor, predominantly black neighborhoods. What Washington Mayor Marion Barry said a year ago applies to the city's drug war today.
I would say 80% of the murders we've had here have been drug users and drug dealers killing each other. They're just mean, and therefore life has no value, apparently.
A familiar scenario, the execution of the young man who drove this car. Reportedly, he stole money from drug dealers. 4 men riddled him with bullets while he waited at a traffic light at midday. Several innocent people have been hit by drug dealers' gunfire, but Washington's mainstream bastions and affluent neighborhoods largely have been immune to the violence. Nonetheless, the concentration of news organizations, the federal bureaucracy, and the Congress in Washington has made the city's death toll nationally known.
What we want to do is to offer some help at the federal level, to get in, to help, and then to get out so that the District of Columbia can run its own affairs.
Last week, drug czar William Bennett chose Washington as the first showcase of the federal government's anti-drug effort. At a Senate hearing later in the week, Senator Warren Rudman lambasted the city's leadership for failing to stem the violence and called for a federal takeover of the 3,900-member Washington police force.
You can't have people killed and blood running in the streets of the city like it was some third world capital run by a despot. It's absurd. It's the mayor's fault, obviously. It's lousy leadership. And there are those of us sitting here quietly looking at the situation saying, enough's enough at some point.
Meanwhile, the curfew law passed by the Washington City Council was aimed at protecting children and teenagers from the violence and at getting other young people out of the drug markets. Children often act as drug couriers. Last year, a 12-year-old allegedly working for a drug dealer was murdered. The curfew law was to take effect today over the opposition of Washington Mayor Marion Barry. But a Washington judge suspended the curfew temporarily, based on the assertion of the American Civil Liberties Union that the law is unconstitutional.
Here, where the problem is so glaring, so out of control, serious questions of local politics and governance can no longer be avoided or excused.
Bennett promised technical assistance from the FBI, aid from the military, possible deployment of the National Guard, more and tougher prosecutions of drug offenders. He also promised to move some city prisoners to federal jails and build new prisons for Washington and the surrounding region. But 6 months later, Bennett complained that the city was dragging its feet, especially on building a new prison.
Do we want to see drug dealers down the road in a prison, or do we want to see them down the street in the shadows? And we're going to have to bite this bullet as a country and build these places and accept them, or the guys are not going to be in prison. They're going to be down the street, down the hall, down the block.
Washington officials say finding a place for a new prison has been a delicate political issue for years, and Bennett should not have expected a quick resolution. It was typical of disputes to follow between Washington officials and their new federal partners. City officials say Bennett's staff has been detached, uninvolved in the anti-drug efforts of the city or the community. And for its part, the city has its own image problems because of the much publicized cocaine arrest of Mayor Marion Barry, who was scheduled to go to trial in June. Questions about the mayor upstaged this morning's press conference, where Bennett and Washington drug czar Sterling Tucker were to report on the year-old D.C. initiative.
Look, I don't really comment on the mayor. I don't really think about the mayor. I think about citizens of Washington and what we can do to improve that situation.
I'm the principal spokesperson for this problem, so whatever's wrong with this war on drugs is my responsibility. In the District of Columbia, and I accept full responsibility for it.
A seemingly uncomfortable Bennett admitted his much-heralded intervention into the D.C. drug war had shown no significant success.
The city of Washington is still in trouble. Helping fix that trouble is not easy. Has not been easy, as I knew and I said last year at this time. Work in some very serious areas on some very serious topics is not as far along as I'd like to see it.
Bennett said the most glaring example of that lack of progress is the city's homicide toll, a new record.
Last year's D.C. murder rate and an apparent continuing trend into this year are a bitter disappointment to all concerned.
On the issue of a new prison to ease massive overcrowding, Bennett said the federal government would accept 500 new D.C. prisoners, but his promised new facility was not in sight.
We had initially intended to construct and operate a new federal prison at an identified area site, as then unidentified. As you know, but this project has now entered the American NIMBY, or not in my backyard syndrome, lore, and enough said about that for the moment.
But there also were hopeful signs in Bennett's report, and they seem to be reflected in Washington communities like this one, once ravaged by drug-related gun battles. Bustling open-air drug markets once were commonplace here and in other of the city's mostly poor, mostly black neighborhoods. They are no longer in evidence, though city officials say many of the sellers and buyers simply have moved indoors or to more isolated streets like this one.
Going to grandmother's house.
An apparent increase in police presence here in the city's notorious 7th District may be one reason.
While we're out here, we need the visibility of the police force.
A few blocks away, the open drug trade also has been harassed by citizens' patrols, made up largely of middle-aged residents. Organizers say their presence eliminated a virtual curbside drug supermarket that flourished on this block 2 months ago. It's estimated there are more than 6,000 patrol members throughout Washington.
Mainly, it's losing their community, losing their kids, losing their homes. This is what they're afraid of, really.
But organizer Foreman says his patrol came about without help from William Bennett's federal forces or from Washington officials.
No one from the federal government has approached anybody in any of the Orange Hat coalitions that I know of. We have no input from the federal government per se, and no input from the district government besides the Metropolitan Police Department.
Washington also has seen a sharp decline in the use of the hallucinogen PCP and may be benefiting from the apparent national decline in cocaine use. Buttressing such hopeful signs is a new statistic. Washington, alone among 23 major cities, recently saw an 11% drop in the number of people arrested who tested positive for cocaine.
The drug use data accumulated through such programs is thought to be significant for two reasons. Arrestees are a population in which drug use is especially concentrated, and use levels and trends among arrestees tend to anticipate those for the general population.
But Washington officials say if the number of cocaine users here is indeed down, the supply and purity of the drug have not diminished. And the deadly rivalry among drug dealers continues. For residents of the violence-plagued 7th District, like Bill Easter, comes criticism of the joint federal-city anti-drug effort.
A lot more could have been done. I think there's been a little too much bickering between the federal government and the local government as far as the, where the blame goes. They're blaming each other for, I guess, the funds or manpower or not enough this and that. And it's not good to hear all that bickering, especially when the residents, we're all keyed in on trying to clean up the drugs, and the government's fighting and arguing among themselves, and it's not a good morale booster.
Others say the Bennett plan missed the mark by failing to add significant drug treatment facilities to cut down Washington's waiting lists of drug users.
If we attempt to make an effort in helping them, then maybe they'll look and they'll help themselves. Then the drug dealers wouldn't be able to get these fancy cars, all this money, because they living off us. They living off the people that's on drugs.
So 1 year after the federal government's first targeted domestic anti-drug initiative, the results in Washington are mixed. And pessimists say the improvements may just be temporary swings in the drug cycle, and that the issues of poverty and economics that contribute to the problem remain unaddressed.